Hello, and welcome to Midweek Mochas at the Owlery. When starting the home education adventure, it's natural to think of school the way you probably experienced it. Sitting still, being quiet for long periods of time, in an uncomfortable desk, with pens and paper and books and workbooks. Your kids may be forced to use Chromebooks or computers these days, but it's still basically the same. It's like being in a meeting that never ends.
Yep.
But if you think back, field trips were just as much a part of school as the bookwork, sometimes the more memorable part of school. And in fact, we'd like to argue that spending more time in the field is one of the benefits of educating at home.
Yes, and there are all kinds of things that you can do to extend education beyond the desk. So today we want to encourage you to leave the classroom behind and see just how much fun and memorable school can be. So, I have an issue that has been one of the things that has plagued us the entire homeschooling adventure, and that's that I've got a kind of fear of missing out, fear that I'm not doing enough.
Fear of the authorities.
Yeah. And this
has been a big cause of friction.
And this is going to be probably feeling familiar to a lot of you because it's a common personality type.
Is it really?
Yes. Yes, it is. I keep telling you, you are unusual. Anyhow. Especially if you're new to homeschooling, it's going to be a fear because you're used to a different way of doing things. But even if you've been doing this a long time, it still may be that sort of nagging thing in the back, especially if it's like, am I doing enough with my third grader? Should they be having a science class? What should that science class look like? And do I need a textbook? And it can become a real source of anxiety. And one of the things that he did was pointing out, you can relax about the third grader. He's out there in the backyard figuring out what the names of all of the birds we have visiting us are. And he's got
birds, the beetles, the everything that creepeth and crawleth upon the earth.
The possum that visits us at night. And we've got a regular wild kingdom and we've got a suburban quarter acre.
Not even a full quarter acre.
And you don't have to go that much further down. I think the park we play at has had coyotes and bobcats show up at it.
Yeah, they live there.
Yeah, so.
And we're in a city.
Yes.
We're in a metropolitan area. We're not out in the wilds.
And so that recognition of my kids are already doing science was one of those big revelations that we had. And what we figured out was, field trips and doing things in the concrete in general, experiential learning, is actually often far more effective than the sort of categorization aspect that book learning tends to have. And that's when we started realizing, field trips are the best part of school. And one of the freedoms that you have as a home educator is you can have a lot more of them because you're not trying to coordinate with 30 other kids from 30 different families and figuring out the budget. If you're going to your local park and it's a mile away, you could probably even walk there. And we're talking zero outlay of money. It's just an outlay of time. But now you're going into an opportunity to study nature. And if you need to have that reassurance of this thing I'm doing is school, well, I've got a giant list of all of the things that you could probably do in an area really close to you without having to necessarily drive hundreds of miles away, that you can look back and say, oh, that thing was history. That was art. That was science. That was music. And you can throw a category on it, but it's still, the point is that it's education, and it's education that's going to stick with you.
Yeah.
So you had been pointing out to me about the importance of learning from experience and why that is a thing.
Well, human beings learn from experience. You have to go from the concrete to the abstract. You have to go from the specific to the general.
So speaking of, let's come up with a concrete example of how this for a child. How does a child learn what a bird is?
So we can talk about birds, but a specific example, I was shepherding a 2-year-old the other day around church so that his parents could attend the service, and he was identifying things. He was identifying the ground. So I started explaining, not even explaining, just ground, bird, car. That instinctive need to identify things and recognize that this is a thing and this is a thing and this is a thing. You get into the different kinds of birds once you already have a concrete experience of what a bird is. There was actually a thing that came up, a bat of some kind won, I believe, a New Zealand competition for coolest bird or something like that. Because the word that's translated as bird into English in the Maori actually just means flying thing.
Interesting.
So their language recognizes different categories than English does. So consequently, you can have a bat win a competition for birds.
Well, incidentally, I wonder if even the English concept of birdness shifts when you add in the decision to classify bats as mammals because they nurse their young.
Right. Well, that's part of my point, is that observing the world and interacting with the world, living your life, that's the education. All the way you classify and categorize it, that's completely artificial. So don't let a need to classify or categorize override the important stuff. Don't let school get in the way of education. Education's too important to let school interfere.
An interesting point. So, one of the things that I have been working on, and I believe it's actually going to come out before this does, is a video of our recent vacation. Show you off your new mug.
Oh, right. We went down to Padre Island in South Texas near Corpus Christi. It's a barrier island, so while we were there, we talked about barrier islands, we talked about waves and sand, we talked about beach ecology, sand dunes. The kids had some time, we all had some time to observe the ghost crabs that live in the beach, sandpipers hunting them, gulls and other seabirds.
Pelicans.
Yeah, lots of pelicans.
Mm-hmm.
We did see some leaping fish.
Oh, yes.
And also talking about the development in the area. There was lots of construction going on as new dwellings are being built, as some of the beachheads are being pushed out and developed.
And so what you're hearing is we were on vacation, and it's easy to think of, vacation away from school. But the fact was, yes, we were away from the school books. Mostly. We actually had 2 classes kids had to log into while we were there.
Yeah, I mean, when you're doing an online class, you might have to adjust your schedule, but just because the kids were in an online class, we scheduled our travel periods around making sure they had access to Wi-Fi to log into their classes and so forth.
But that wasn't the only education that happened while we were...
We spent time at the beach. We went to an aircraft carrier that was put into service in World War II and more or less remained in service until the mid-90s. That's been turned into a living history museum. There are all sorts of exhibits. We spent a whole day and we saw a fraction of the thing. If we lived in the Corpus Christi area, we would just get a regular membership to it.
Yeah.
But other things we did on that vacation, we played a board game about the emergence and development of ancient civilizations. It's one of my favorite games. It's a game I started playing over 30 years ago, and I have wanted to share the full game with the family. Mm-hmm. But it takes a long time to play, especially when you're teaching people.
It takes a week to play.
Well, we didn't even finish.
No, you didn't.
We used to play it over the course of 2 to 3 weeks in school.
But it's like every free moment. And we had 2 days of basically downtime recovering from various sort of exhaustion, sunburn type things, and just needing time to relax. We played a lot on those. Mm-hmm. But it's a lot.
We watched a couple of movies and had discussions about those.
Yeah.
I think one of our kids was working on an essay for one of his other commitments, and so we talked through some of that. So there were a lot of discussions around all of that. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, it was a vacation. I stayed unplugged from the office for a whole week. We went out more than we normally do so that there was less cooking for, Laura and I and the older kids to juggle. But we had a little vacation rental, so we got to explore different aspects of the layout and how other people live, and we spent a lot of time at the beach and exploring what the beach had to offer, and we spent some time exploring what the local area had to offer.
Mm-hmm. And that was one of those ways that if you're trying to say, well, how do you take a field trip and turn it into education? That's what you do, is you just go out and live, and then in the aftermath you can look back and say, oh, well, when we were at the beach, that was there was botany, because there's some fascinating plants that grow there.
Mm-hmm.
There was zoology, because you had all of the different animals. There's geology. You can start
meteorology.
Yeah, you can start naming the and categorizing the areas of study that you might classify all of these things, but they're happening in a more integrated manner.
And that's the important part. The whole idea of like work-life balance is nonsense. There's life. Part of your life you spend working in order to support the part of your life you spend living. Hopefully you get to work at something that you enjoy and that fulfills you, but that's not a luxury everyone has. What's more important is that you recognize it's an artificial distinction, and that schooling, as we experience it, is also built on those artificial distinctions, which is why I constantly beat the drum. Don't let schooling get in the way of a good education.
But it is helpful sometimes when either you're trying to figure out what rough category does this thing fit into. You can actually look through the opportunities and say, okay, I can think of different places that we could go that might be widely considered an exploration of history, like going and visiting the aircraft carrier.
Or a battlefield, or a house. Like, I know growing up in New Orleans, we routinely went on trips to the French Quarter, and while most tourists go to the French Quarter to go to the bars, you didn't take school kids to field trips to the bars on Bourbon Street, not normally. But there is the Cabildo, there is the Presbytery, there is the St. Louis Cathedral, all right on Jackson Square.
And those are a huge part of understanding the history and founding of the city, the peoples that at various times were in charge of the area.
Because New Orleans was the administrative center of the French province, then the Spanish province, then the French province again. And then I think it changed hands into France one more time, not unlike Texas did, before Louisiana and the Mississippi watershed were sold to the United States.
And so just visiting those buildings, you've got this very concrete way of understanding the history of your city. If you drive up the river, following the river road, there's a whole host of plantations, and now you can dig into what was the settlement of the Louisiana Territory like, what were the primary crops that were driving the economy, what was the social aspect of how the area developed. And that plantation can tell you a huge amount. If you visit Oak Alley, for example, of what was the history of Louisiana.
Yeah, Oak Alley, Destrehan, there's at least a dozen others.
And yet at the same time, you can be exploring things like architecture, because they have very different appearances, showing different periods of time and fashions.
Just traveling along the River Road and realizing that road has been in use for traffic between New Orleans and Baton Rouge since the trading posts were established.
And so even as you're studying things like history, you may also have an aspect of architecture sneak its way in, and that's an aspect of art study.
Social studies, if you want to talk about the movements of peoples. There were indigenous peoples in southeast Louisiana who initially traded with the French. The influx of the Acadian people, the French Canadians who came down more or less after the Revolutionary War. You also had a lot of loyalists who ended up moving to Canada from the colonies following the establishment of the United States.
And so you can see that there's a difficulty in throwing a category on it. Now, I grew up in the Baltimore-Annapolis area. And so for us, we had a wealth of sites we could visit. I mean, if you could go down to D.C., where there was the American History Museum, as well as Washington, D.C., and all of the buildings and all of the significance that comes from seeing the White House, the Capitol building, etc. But we also had Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor, which is the place where the Star Spangled Banner was flying that Francis Scott Key wrote about. That was we visited that at least twice in elementary school, now that I think about it. It was a very popular place to visit. But it's also not a bad drive from a place like Williamsburg. And living history museums are one of those things where you can sort of dig into a time period, if that was a place, if your area had a significant thing of battlefields. You had mentioned battlefields. You said Chalmette Battlefield was the one that was
Chalmette Battlefield we went to every year or two. And so that brought the War of 1812 home.
And then living, when you did in Pennsylvania, I think you saw Gettysburg.
That was with my family.
Okay.
That wasn't a school trip. Yeah, the schools I went to didn't do anything with any of the historical stuff in and around Philadelphia.
Which is crazy, because Philadelphia was at the heart of the American War for Independence, when you think about it.
Yeah, there was very little focus on that in any of the formal schooling that I had.
Great shame. But that's the thing, is that if you look at the area you live in, you can find all sorts of interesting ways to dig into your local history, and you're going to end up going well beyond history, so to speak, when you dive into that.
Well, again, because it's an artificial classification.
Exactly.
So how do you deal with the anxiety? Because obviously it's not something I share.
Mm-hmm.
And there's certainly friction when I'm like, well, why are you even worrying about this?
Well, I think that you can deal with it two ways. One of them is just to set it aside and trust that it's all going to work out to some degree.
Okay.
Which is, I think, what you do mostly.
I don't have it.
Okay.
I don't have to set it aside.
That's right. It's not a worry you have.
No.
But I find for me that what I can do is just pick some event, and then in the aftermath I can look and I can say, okay, well, what sort of things do you like? For example, we have a fantastic art museum that we have a membership to. Mm-hmm. And it's another case of, well, studying an art, going to an art museum, that's art. But there's a lot more to it than just studying great art. For example, it has some fantastic collections of some Egyptian pieces,
Yeah, I mean, it's not the Met, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, but you can get a guided tour of material culture and history by looking at the procession of artifacts.
And that's actually where you start to recognize that history studied as its own category kind of is dead. But once you start looking at it through a lens, like art, when you start looking at the material culture of different peoples, that becomes a way to dig into and see what happens as you see a progression in styles, for example. Mm-hmm. For example, looking at the Greeks, you can see the change from certain kinds of sculpture or the making of columns, and you can categorize them, but what you're more importantly digging into is starting to make connections between when they were making this kind of sculpture or doing this kind of column, this was what was going on, and it gives you lens. That was actually something I recall from theater history, and I'll point out, going to the theater, seeing a play is an opportunity for digging into literature.
It can be.
It can be.
It can be.
You have to be careful about what you choose.
Well, and that's the problem with theatrical presentations today, is so many theater companies are trying to be shocking because it's the only thing they know how to be anymore. It's getting harder and harder to find honest presentations of good theater.
But if you can find, say, a good presentation of Shakespeare, that's a much better way to approach the play than trying to just read it, because they're meant to be performed. But you also, when we were in our theater history classes, I learned more about history studying it through the plays written at different times in history and understanding how those plays were the products of those times. Mm-hmm. That the Greek plays were the products of men who had been in the wars between Greece and Persia.
Brian Derry's book, Theater of War, goes into that.
Yeah. And then similarly, as you go throughout the history of the different plays, you start connecting into different time periods and your framework of history expands. And now you are just in watching plays, you are also learning history at the same time. So do you think
it's important to establish that framework, possibly using book work, in order to have the pegs in your mind to hang those things on? Or do you think you can start with the experiences and then you start constructing, you start ordering the furniture that's now there?
I honestly think you could do it both directions.
So embrace the healing power of Anne.
Yes, because on the one hand, you can go see a play and then afterwards say, so when was this written? And
by whom?
By whom and where? But now they care because they saw a play and they were laughing hysterically as the twin brothers kept running on and off stage, just missing each other.
Yes.
I will point out, local universities can sometimes be your best source of good theater, as ours is. But
we have a very unusual university.
Okay.
We have several.
That's true. That's true. But
we also happen to know the people who run the theater department at one of the local universities.
That is also true.
We were classmates with them.
Yes. But you can go the other direction. Like, we had been briefly considering stopping in San Antonio on one of the directions of our trip. And I had thought, this is a case where learning the history beforehand might actually make more sense.
Right.
Because obviously if you go to San Antonio, you want to visit the Alamo. But it's just an interesting looking building until you understand that part of Texas history.
Right.
Now, I happen to have a fantastic history textbook written for middle school aged kids. That I'm going to
It's brief.
It's brief, and I'm going to be digging into it with the kids. And
yeah, this whole episode is not to say don't ever do book work.
No.
But
it's more the in what order and in what proportion.
Textbooks and workbooks are developed to fit an industrial process model and make it easy on a teacher to manage a room full of 30 pupils by keeping them occupied with busy work. Stop and think for a moment. Can you quote a single sentence out of your third grade social studies textbook?
I can't. But
I can, and I've got a pretty damn good memory.
But I can remember really well some of the stuff we did in my second grade history class because it was stuff we did. We learned to square dance, and we made little Conestoga wagons, and we learned quilting because we
were reading a lot of Laura Ingalls Wilder and did a presentation on life on the prairie as a homesteader.
And we were studying the pioneers. And we were studying the pioneers through activities that helped us to understand what was their life like. And that made us care enough to know, well, when was that and where was that?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the key, is that you're doing experiences, visiting places that are going to create sticky and memorable things, concrete experiences that are going to stay with you. I visited the Donner Party cabin. At the time, I didn't know what it was, but I was told a very gruesome story about it. There happens to be a Nathan Hale's Hazardous Tales story about it also.
You should link to that in the show notes.
I will link to that. But having actually visited that cabin and seeing how remote it was,
mm-hmm.
when you hear the story, you can get it. And visiting places will make those events stay with you in a way that just having it skim through a book, it's the sort of thing, like, occasionally something we'll remember. I remember in my American history books the Teapot Dome scandal just because the name is funny.
Mm-hmm.
But there's lots of other significant events that it's really hard to recall because if they don't have a funny name, there's no reason to. It's just so much chaff. It comes in. You remember
noise,
yeah.
And you don't have any clear signal to discern from the noise.
Right, and so it's hard to pick out what's important, what's not important, and if it's all important, none of it's important.
So, real quick, list of 20 possible things you can consider. Museums in general, battlefields or significant houses. Living history sites.
Places like Williamsburg, etc., where they've got people in costume doing the activities and being able to speak as if they were of that time period.
Yes. Again, different kinds of museums, art museums, art studios.
I think out in Fort Worth, they've got, say, someone who does glass blowing. So seeing those...
Lots of libraries now have maker spaces. Where you can learn various crafts and so forth and how to use various tools that it may be too expensive to have in a typical home, or you may not have the space for if you live in, say, a condo or an apartment in a major city. There are resources. Look at theatrical performances. Look at staged readings. Look at amateur drama groups, library trips. Lots of libraries have programs of read-alouds or book clubs or workshops. Ours offered a chess club for a while. Let's see, symphonies, philharmonics, musical events, even concerts of more contemporary music can afford an opportunity to examine the social dynamics, to experience something. Also, in regard to music, lots of churches will do concert series of sacred choral or instrumental music. Sometimes that's your best bet rather than a big symphony orchestra for getting some of these Renaissance and Baroque pieces, for hearing really well executed choral pieces. One of the Baptist churches here in the Dallas area has one of the best organs in the country. And so it is one of the top places worldwide to go for organ recitals. They bring in great organ scholars, but if you're not kind of looped in, you wouldn't even think to check.
Yeah, and I think in a similar vein, I know that there was one of the churches that was hosting a group that particularly did polyphony, was it Baroque music, but it was Baroque music composed in New Spain.
Yes,
so
the Orchestra of the New Spain.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a locally based music group. They're basically a chamber music group. And they do concerts and they have recordings, but it's all polyphonic and Baroque era compositions. Baroque era polyphonic compositions from what we would now call Mexico and South Texas, that was all composed here in the New World in what at the time was New Spain. There are these sorts of groups everywhere. There's a really, really good one out in California that I love listening to their YouTube. I want to say it's Voices of Music.
Yeah.
The Suspicious Cheese Lords. Lots of good stuff. Again, these groups tour, so you can get out of the house and go to a concert. They're usually very affordable, and the intimacy of the experience is part of what makes it very, very sticky. Rolling into, okay, well, what do you do about STEM? Because everybody's all worked up about that, and I have my own thoughts on STEM and whatnot for another time. But star parties. There are local astronomy groups that organize stargazing parties with and without telescopes.
As well as planetariums, because sometimes the sky is cloudy, but planetariums are a way that you can still have that opportunity to look at a simulated sky and get that same experience.
Do some schools have their own planetaria? Absolutely. Do most? No. So just like, kids in most institutional schools, organize a trip to the planetarium and do some stargazing. Coordinate with some other folks that you homeschool with. See if y'all can get a group rate and the place to yourself for the day.
Now, your planetarium may be attached to a local science museum.
In which case, turn it into a whole event.
And a lot of cities do have fantastic science centers, and you have everything from places like the Museum of Natural History, which tends to be sort of more static exhibits, to places that are very experiential, and you can see Tesla coils in action and all sorts of other things, and you'll remember what those are because you touched them, because you played with them.
People tend to think of national parks, and we certainly spent a lot of time last year going to through a couple of national parks in the Texas and New Mexico areas. Don't forget state and local parks. Also, usually very modestly priced, usually much closer than a national park unless you live in certain areas of the country. Lots of opportunity to observe local flora, local fauna, botanical gardens, zoos. And again, I know I'd mentioned this in connection with like libraries, but look for chess clubs, because while we have a chess club sponsored at the library, there's also a chess club that is just generally for our area. They put on regular tournaments. Even if you don't want to compete in them, go and observe them. Get to know people. Lego clubs, rocketry clubs. And
these are all
robotics. And we had a bunch of friends who their kids all did robotics stuff.
And while a lot of them tend to be connected to schools, you can find ones like through libraries and other publicly accessible sources, and that gives you that opportunity to get out of the house, do something with your hands, do something experiential, and often do that with other people who are like-minded, who are going to now that I think about it, there's probably things like, radio clubs, and, getting into, again, you're having that opportunity to dig into something where you can practice it, and you're going to learn and so much from doing something hands-on. I mean, rocketry is the one I think of, because you've got the chemistry of the rocketry as you're trying to figure out.
And the physics.
And can I make this thing actually go up where I want it to, and how do I make it fly better?
Yeah. Something to also think about, is there something you as an adult human being are passionate about? Is it cars of a particular make or era? Is it running? I've got an acquaintance who's a really hardcore runner, and running is something he's passionate about. Well, can you share those passions with your children? Yes, you can. Does that help them develop into, oh, this is something that adults do? Yes, it can. Can it be classified if you need to put it on a school transcript? Absolutely. That's the easy part. But if you are into British cars, or racing BMWs, or Formula One, or NASCAR, or a particular sport.
Yeah, I mean, we were just actually working on a high school transcript for our oldest, who's doing college.
Finally decided he wants to go to college.
Yeah, but as he's been doing the applications, it's like, how do I put all this stuff in order? And as we're going through, some of the stuff's fairly easy to classify, and then we realized the way we watch films, that was basically a film appreciation class. Mm-hmm. Because we don't just, watch a movie and say, wow, that was a great movie. We stop and start and discuss and talk about angles and, why a Dutch angle says that things are kind of off kilter. And you're going into discussing the story and
the techniques of filmmaking, the techniques of storytelling, and why the various aspects of the production had the impact they did.
Yeah. At that point, you've got a class, or in retrospect, you can say that you studied something because you took your passion for film and you passed it on to your child in such a way that you can say, no, we really did basically do a class in how to make and understand movies. Mm-hmm. And you probably have something of your own that is that thing for you.
Yeah. Figure out what lights you up and be willing to share that with your kids.
Yeah.
Invite them into that part of your adult world.
I think we had one last thing on the list, and that was pointing out that,
increasingly neglected in many schools now is physical education. Give your kids plenty of time to just run around and be kids.
Yeah.
I don't care how old they are. That's really one of the most important things you can do. Even when you get out to do these sorts of touring experiences or field trips or whatever, make sure to bake time into the schedule to just sit and relax while the kids run themselves ragged.
Yeah.
But consider athletic clubs and, group sports activities, swim teams.
If you're in a city, you've probably got city recreation centers. You've probably got YMCA's.
We have one that has a climbing wall and thus a climbing club.
Yes, and you can through that find through both the city and the Y. We've got various sports teams available that you can get involved in. Swim teams at your Y or local natatorium. And then
our kids for the most part have glommed onto martial arts. Mm-hmm. It's something I studied over 30 years ago and have been happy to get back into. They've all really taken to it, and it's opened up a completely different world. They have a whole group of friends they've cultivated through there. And then the other thing I would say that's actually not on the list at the moment, but churches. One of my aunts used to do tours of churches in the New Orleans area to go look at the stained glass.
Yeah.
Not necessarily for the religious experience, but just looking at the material culture and what's the language of this stained glass, or in Eastern churches, what's the language of the icons, and what's all of that's part of the world we have inherited and live in. And all of that can be a significant formative experience.
Mm-hmm. And whether you're talking stained glass or icons, both of them have a visual language that we've to some degree become illiterate about.
Yeah.
And so learning to read
them again.
Yeah, that's huge. I think one of the most significant moments I remember, I think it was the National Cathedral, which I believe is Episcopalian. And going through and seeing the stained glass there and being shocked to discover the window that had the space shuttle on it. Mm-hmm. And realizing, well, that's because this cathedral is a cathedral.
It's a secular national monument to the civic religion. It's not and so that's a significant event.
And so it's about what it means to be American and the space race, and trying to go to the stars is part of our country's character.
Or at least it was.
And was baked into the choice for the window design.
Right.
And that moment of seeing, well, why did they put this thing there? And reading that from the glass is a moment that has some impact.
And I will routinely get, at least once a month, an email from, it could be a group from another church. It could be from a group of homeschoolers asking, hey, can we come to your church and kind of experience what you do? Because they're curious. I know when I was in school, we were taken to a mosque at one point. We didn't assist in the prayer service, but we got to talk with an imam and ask what questions we had about Islam and whatnot. And I know I had an acquaintance who used to, he was a cantor in a synagogue. He was Catholic, but he was a cantor for the local synagogue. And so he would work with the rabbi to help bring some of the religion classes to see what is a synagogue, what's in a synagogue, how do Jews pray, how do these people live, if it's outside your ordinary experience. And so getting to know some of that, I know we've got a I think it's a Buddhist, we've got a Buddhist retreat center nearby as well. And we'll sometimes see the monks in their saffron robes cycling around the area to and from the grocery.
And I mean, the point of education is to broaden your knowledge and understanding of the world.
To remove ignorance and to lead the soul out of the cave.
And so that's, going out into the field is going to places that you're unfamiliar with so that you may learn about them. Mm-hmm. And it could be as simple as finding someplace in your city that you haven't been to before and seeing what is there to learn about it from that.
Lots and lots of stuff to explore, and exploration enables the possibility of encounter, and encounter is where the person can be transformed.
Yes.
I think that wraps it up for today. I hear the bell tolling. It tolls for thee. This is just a starting point.
Yeah.
Really, to try and change your perspective. Consider things in a different light as to what education is, how it happens, and how to go forth and do it.
Yes. And to make it a bit more concrete, I will have a link to the vacation footage, which I have edited into a video. I'll have that link in the show notes, and I'll probably have a little box pointing to it at the end of the video as well.
Okay.
And that way people can see, how did we take our vacation and use it as an opportunity to explore the world and broaden our kids' understanding of all kinds of areas that could be studied.
Yeah.
All right.
If you have any questions, please leave a message in the comments. Contact us by email or through social media. We've got our website up. Links are in the show notes. Let us know what you'd like to hear about next. How can we help you? Please share this with your friends. Please share this with your enemies. Do the whole like, subscribe, yada, yada, yada thing. Until next week, ciao, ciao.